back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with another episode of Pedalhead. Last time we took a look at two of the most iconic clipping diode overdrives, and I kind of lied when I said we'd be moving on to something different because indeed we are looking at actually three clipping diode pedals again, but I figured it was kind of logical because I didn't want to move too far away from the concept, because today we are looking at the MXR ZW44 and the MXR ZW44. If you're a recent subscriber or just a long-time viewer who's really bad at taking a hint, you may not know that I'm quite the fan of Zakk Wylde. We've taken a look at many products and tones that have to do with his guitar playing style, and that's why I figured we'd be taking a look at these two overdrive pedals. So they are similar in name, ZW44, though this one is known as the Wylde Overdrive, this one is known as the Berzerker Overdrive. And the reason I wanted to cover it this video, this soon after the clipping diode pedals, is because they are both derivatives of the infamous Super Overdrive, which we took a deep dive into last episode, and because of that, we'll be putting this head-to-head with both of these pedals. So Zakk Wylde was a longtime user of the Super Overdrive when he eventually got with MXR to build him essentially a clone, a very close derivative. These things are kissing cousins in more way than one, and we'll be taking a look at that. The Wylde Overdrive itself is actually a direct derivative of the pre-existing GT Overdrive from MXR. In fact, it's like a couple resistor cap change and you short a part of the circuit and it literally becomes a Wylde Overdrive. The Wylde Overdrive released, I think, 2003, 2004 time frame. This was actually my first legitimate overdrive pedal. I've had it since, like, I don't know, maybe the second week I started playing guitar, and I've used it to boost distortion pedals, boost clean, dirty channels, and so I'm fairly familiar with this sound, and that's why I've always liked the super OD style of a pedal. The Berzerker Overdrive is the newer of Zakk's signatures, and it came out around the 2010 to 11 time frame, if I remember correctly. I haven't had it nearly as long. I've actually picked it up quite late just out of curiosity, because I was always like, well, I've got this, what's the point in this? And the changes were a little more than subtle in terms of the tonal profile, in terms of the clipping, the output level, but as we'll soon see, they're all still relatively similar. So as we saw in the last video, there's quite a few things you can do with a clipping diode pedal, although Zakk Wylde uses this for one reason and one reason alone, and that's to turn JCM 800 style amplifiers into fire-breathing riff machines, because you can crank the gain as high as you want, but you're still going to get kind of a flubby, loose bottom end, and that's what these pedals essentially do. Add a little bit more drive, more saturation, tighten up the bass response, and that's kind of important when you have a short scale down-tuned guitar with E and Gs, and it turns, you know, basically anything into sounding like him. You can even throw one of these in front of something like a solid-state Marshall MG amp and get tones that are reminiscent of Zakk Wylde's famous sound. And because these are so very similar, I'm going to take a very, very brief tour through some of the features, some of the components of each pedal, and mainly because with the Tube Screamer versus Super OD, there's, you know, all kinds of different revisions. We just took kind of a high-level tour of an asymmetrical versus symmetrical clipping pedal, but where these are so similar, we're getting into hair-splitting territory to even be able to tell them apart sonically, let alone in terms of the circuit design. So we'll start with the Super Overdrive. The SD1 employs the JRC 4558 Double D chip in the same way that a lot of old school 808 designs do, so still reminiscent in terms of that design philosophy, but the older pedals used 1S1588 diodes, and I confirmed that this is indeed a more recent pedal because this uses the 1S2473 diodes, and purportedly the older pedals were smoother sounding. They didn't have quite that abrasive gain structure that you'll hear out of something like this. I prefer this. That's what makes a Super Overdrive so you know, unique in terms of the other Tube Screamer clones, is the asymmetrical distortion and how it brings about that more amp-like crunch. The original ZW44 has a pretty well documented circuit as well, and in fact is so close to the Super Overdrive, there are many forum posts with mods that tell you exactly how to turn one of these into one of these, and kind of makes me want to do it maybe one day, get you know, kind of a crummier looking SD1 and Basically, you chuck some resistors, some capacitors, you change a diode or two out, and you turn it into this pedal or something that is going to resemble it very closely. Of course, you got different potentiometers and some other things you could do to it, but essentially they are that close. They are the same circuit with a few different resistor values. I believe the output buffer is different, but were entirely removed on these Wylde overdrive pedals. But other than that, they're basically the same thing. It's really not that surprising considering that around the time this thing came out, I don't think that MXR had an SD1 direct competitor. They had, two Screamer likes, but I imagine Zakk Wylde was using, other Dunlop and MXR pedals, and basically he said, yeah, just make me this and throw my bullseye on it. That way I can be using, have the same brand on my pedal board. So at the time, it was kind of excusable to throw a bullseye on was essentially a SD1 clone, but anymore it's a little cliche to say the least. Now, the Berzerker overdrive, on the other hand, this was what led to basically dead ends on my research. As far as I can tell, a lot of the same sort of diodes, practically the same chip, all these things used on the Wylde overdrive, but this thing's kind of informationless in terms of the design. I've seen a couple drawings, but it looks the same. It looks, more or less like the same topography of this pedal, but the changes must have been important enough to yield the results that you're about to hear, because the gain structure on this, the level, the range of output is quite a bit different in terms of the clipping. I feel this is a less woofy pedal compared to this, although even this does have a bit more of that fuzzy, boomy sort of distortion compared to the SD1. But there are definitely similarities in terms of design as far as the tone goes. So I actually took a min-max EQ match. Of course, this isn't doing anything with clipping. This is just what the frequency spectrum is looking like. This is comparisons between all three of these pedals, again with the tone at minimum, tone at maximum. All these measurements were made with the output at noon, which is not the best way to go about it because of potentiometer differences, but it's all the same. And gain at minimum to minimize the clipping. And as you can tell, the EQ profile is practically identical. In fact, I would say all of this is within margin of error based on the way I conducted the test. Pedal to pedal variance and all that. So if you had any doubts before that these things were basically the same pedals in terms of the circuit, well, doubt no more, because that's pretty much proof. And I would bet that all the outlier frequencies that you see that have a more significant spread are all noise, because guitars frequencies, at least the raw frequencies, don't expand that far anyway, so it really wouldn't matter what you're doing boost or cut wise. So let's have a listen to the full range of each one of these pedals in front of a flubby high gain amplifier before we get on to some more scientific testing. As I mentioned previously, that use case is basically the only way Zakk uses these pedals is to drive the front end of a high gain amplifier, but I thought it'd still be interesting to see how each one of these pedals handles the clean to mid gain, mild breakup type of scenario. So we'll be starting with sort of a light breakup JTM sort of amplifier sound, even to Fender clean sound, and then we'll move on to some higher gain applications after. As with some of my previous testing, I am still fairly surprised how well these sort of pedals handle that mild breakup sound. We always associate the Tube Screamer with those sort of applications, but this works fairly well in some of the lower gain, lower drive positions. And the differences, I mean, there's some of those tests where these at the same settings sounded identical, these at the same settings sounded identical, these couldn't have sounded further apart at the same settings in terms of the gain, but EQ-wise, they all kind of did the same thing. So at least this clean test sort of shows that I think a lot of it is coming down to how these pots are tapered or where the starting point is, because even at the minimum gain setting, this thing just sounds more raw, more like there is more clipping going on, versus the Berzerker being more transparent at the same settings, which is kind of funny considering this is a Berzerker overdrive, it should be balls to the walls, but maybe that's part of what they were trying to solve in the original design, and letting it just be a little more transparent, a little more of the clean signal come through without being so woofy, boomy that the way this sounds. But this is just a clean application, so how it's going to respond in front of a dirty amp, that's a completely different ballpark. So we'll take a look at a mildly driven amplifier. We're not talking super high gain, maybe a lower gain JCM 800, 2204 type of amp. and you know, see if this can send it into a more high gain territory, or you know, kind of a bluesy lead sound. The more gain we're adding to these amps, the harder it's getting to tell these apart, because I'm listening to these again for the first time in a couple days since I've done these tests, and if I look away from the screen, I can't even tell when it changed, aside from a hard clip, because it's changing clips. It's so very close that I honestly think that at certain settings you could turn one off, turn one on, especially in a live setting, or even recording, and probably no one would know you've changed the pedal. There's a certain settings to where maybe one sounds boxier than the other, but especially on the clean boost setting, or Zakk's general sort of high, close to noon on all the settings with roll off on tone, they all just they're so close, and whatever minor changes there are to the circuit is just so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. So as of right now, I don't really have a favorite for either of these applications, just because of the different output levels and that sort of thing for each one. I definitely think the Berzerker so far is sounding the most transparent for clean stuff, which is a good thing if you want to roll off that sort of clipping profile, but Super OD's hanging in there just fine. And again, I'm very familiar with the sound of this pedal because I've had it for so long, so toss up, really. So let's get to where it really matters for these pedals and throw them in front of a sort of higher gain amp. So we're going to get to some classic Zakk Wylde tones from the No More Tears and No Rest for the Wicked eras, and see how each one fares with that. differences are coming down to output level, with gain set at the 9 o'clock region and the other volume controls, tone controls around noon. It's sounding like, you know, this one's just pushing the amp a little harder, a few more decibels of boost versus the Berzerker, but you set it closer to the way Zakk would normally run it, and the differences become almost negligible and within margin of error, I think, for where I can accurately set the potentiometers, the margin of error, the tolerance for all the parts and the pedals. It's like I would take practically any of them, and the Wild Overdrive and Super Overdrive, I mean, these things with monitors sound practically identical. I can hear a few, just barely any difference, but there are some audible anomalies when listening through headphones. But it's kind of funny because these two I jam with a lot, just throwing in front of a halfway dirty channel, and I always feel like there's a bigger difference than there actually is. But between placebo, between thinking it makes me play more different, then I think they really are a lot closer than I thought they were previously. So let's see if any of that changes with even more gain, a more down-tuned guitar, still active pickups, through some flatter, relatively, speakers that, you know, sort of setup that Zakk would run in Black Label Society today. Specific application, there is a very subtle thing with the Berzerker Overdrive I prefer. It's, at least in the same settings, a little less boomy, not as thin sounding as the Super Overdrive in certain frequencies, and this just sounded more like the Black Label Society tone that I have in my head when set to, you know, kind of Zakk Wylde settings. But in a mix, would I be able to tell? Probably not. By the time you chop off a lot of the low end, you get a bass guitar in there, and obviously Zakk can sound like Zakk with any of these three pedals, so I don't think it really matters all that much. But there is something about this. It's not quite as saturated. It's not quite as, you know, muffled on those lower notes that I do prefer. Which is, it's kind of funny. Generally with these sort of tests, you hear less variance the more gain you push in front of the amp. But in this case, I feel like the differences, subtle as they may be, are starting to come out a little more audibly, at least in higher gain applications. So again, no like obvious winner over the other, but there is something that sounds just more the way I'm used to hearing Zakk Wylde recordings with the Berzerker Overdrive. All of them are fine though. So we'll do one last test here. This is kind of a more modern take in front of a 5150, 6505 style amplifier, using this particular riff because one of the former guitarists of this band supposedly used a Wild Overdrive as his boost pedal, and we'll just see how that is handled with a more modern take on heavy metal. the high output, high tone, no gain type of setup. This is, you know, kind of the closest thing to a clean boost you can get out of a clipping diode pedal. And for that application, I think these two are perfectly adequate. They took that one for me because they do retain some of the bottom end presence. It's still tight, you know, going into the amplifier, but it's not quite as thin nasally as this pedal turned out to be at least the same gain settings. Once you turn up just a little bit of clipping, they kind of mellowed out and sounded similar. I think Zakk's preferred settings of, you know, the almost at noon on everything sounded like absolute shit on all these pedals, so that's not what I would recommend at all anyway for that genre. But yeah, I think I kind of prefer the original Wylde Overdrive, the Super Overdrive, for this one, just because they are a little more grisly. In this case, I think the lack of transparency is a good thing with both of these pedals, just with that sort of gain structure, the way I had this amp dialed in with the higher, or at least the high frequencies not being quite as present. And overall, I can't really pick a winner. There's no cut and dry answer on this one. I think a lot of this is going to come down to which paint job do you like better. If you're looking for a sort of generic do-it-all overdrive for this section of the heavy metal spectrum, I mean, I think the Super Overdrive has proven itself plenty that it can do all of that in some way. But I'd say a lot of you are watching this because it's not necessarily what you're looking for. You are a Zakk Wylde fan, or at least have some interest in these particular products, and for that, they are slightly different, enough so where I didn't immediately feel like selling this one off because they are the exact same thing. Obviously, aesthetically, you got, you know, one's an aluminum case, this one's steel. I could beat someone over the head with this. This I'd probably dent. There's a very significant difference in weight. They take up the same amount of space on your pedal board, so if you like that aspect of, you know, the dimensions, then maybe this is a cool way to do it. I prefer the foot switch on Boss pedals. I don't like how you access the battery, not that I use batteries. But other than that, I mean, you're really getting to some hair-splitting territory to tell the difference at all between any of them. And I went into this test thinking, you know, I know the differences are subtle. I know they're clones, but, you know, so many people can tell the difference between a baseline TS9 and a TS808. Surely in a blindfold test, I'll be able to hear when it switches. I really can't in most cases. I can kind of pick this one out, but not really. So in terms of value, in terms of an objective, I guess, review, I would say still the Super Overdrive would be my go-to. It's cheap. You know, you can get them used for like 35 bucks. And if you break it, who cares? There's like a million more out there. If you like some of the very subtle differences in sound that you get out of the other pedals, there's plenty of tutorials online on how to mod one of these. In fact, I would love to mod one of these one day, do the black and white bullseye paint scheme I've seen a couple times. I think that'd be a fun little project. And again, if you screw up, who cares? It's a good learning opportunity, and you can buy more of them. So for that reason, I think this makes the Super Overdrive the go-to. But also, objectively, I think the Berzerker Overdrive does deserve to be in existence still, because it is a bit more transparent. It does do a few different things at similar settings, and it does have a subtle, you know, gain feel. And obviously, there was something about the original Super Overdrive clones that Zakk Wylde thought, yeah, I want to change a few things here or there, or at least make it be a little more different compared to what is, you know, amounts to basically a Super Overdrive clone. So I like the Berzerker Overdrive, and if I had to choose one between the two, now I would choose this one, although, as I've said, I do have an affinity for this, considering I've had it for so long. With that said, now this is kind of, I wouldn't say obsolete, but kind of. It doesn't really have all that much of a right to exist when now MXR doesn't just have to put a bullseye over top of an SD1 clone when they have this. So I guarantee you these are a lot cheaper. Last time I looked, they were in the $50-ish range compared to 70 to 80. But if you're a Zakk Wylde fan and you are collecting the other pedals, then, you know, I would buy this one nowadays. But if you're just strictly want something with a bullseye on it and want the Wylde name, then this is the cheapest way to go. Subjectively speaking, from my own, you know, kind of bias and experience. I think it goes completely out of order, where this one's still kind of my favorite just because I've played it for so long. The SD1 I jam with all the time, and this is the one that sits on the shelf with the other Wylde Audio or MXR Wylde signature pedals. They're not Wylde Audio pedals yet, although I would be interested in seeing those and throwing it up against what I assume is going to be the exact same thing. But regardless, yeah, it's going to come down to money and preference on this one even more than the last one. And so I hope, if anything, you learned that they are that close, that circuits are borrowed and copied that often in pedal design, because, you know, don't fix what's not broken. And I can definitely say this design isn't broken for this sort of guitar playing. So yeah, that is the Wylde Overdrive, the Berzerker Overdrive, and the SD1 all in one video. I don't think I learned a damn thing from this other than they sound closer than I thought they would. And if I was going to put one on a record, I would do a Super Overdrive, just because it's not a signature. That's probably all I learned. Other than that, it was a fun little exercise in reamping and blindfold testing, and I hope you guys got something out of it. So that'll be about that. Thanks for watching. Next time on Pedalhead, we will be doing some sort of different pedal. Maybe it's an overdrive, but it won't be a clipping diode if it is. And yeah, leave some suggestions down below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.